Well, hello again, and this is Dr. Tim Cote at the Keck Graduate Institute, giving the fourth lecture in a series on the fundamentals of a practical guide to food and drug regulation, third edition. This is the book, and this, appropriately enough, follows chapter 4. This lecture is about how the FDA works, its various components inside and the people that it works with outside. So you should know, of course, by now that the Food and Drug Administration is a component, is an agency level of Health and Human Services. Okay, that's the department level, the Department of Health and Human Services. HHS as an agency is where most of the power actually formally lies. In most of the enabling legislation, it's set with the Secretary of HHS. In fact, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act is not formally enforced by the FDA Commissioner, but rather by the Secretary of DHHS. But much of that power is delegated and then re-delegated downward, as we'll mention in a moment. So, since 1988, the Commissioner of FDA has been appointed by the President, but prior to that point was served pretty much at the pleasure of the Secretary of HHS. So the current system is, though, that the President appoints the Commissioner, and that has to be confirmed by the Senate, and yet the Commissioner does report to the Secretary of Health and Human Services. So the Secretary delegates his or her power, her right now, Kathleen Sebelius' power, to Commissioner Hanberg, and the Commissioner then redelegates those powers to the centers, the powers for how to approve drugs, for example, for marketing, and to take enforcement actions. But the Secretary reserves the right to approve FDA's regulations, explicitly reserves that right. So any regulations that FDA might propose still have to actually be issued by the Secretary of Health and Human Services. FDA has frequent reorganizations, as do many agencies throughout HHS. While this has a downside of a lack of continuity, there are advantages in that it allows the agency to be more responsive to changes in technology, changes in science, and changes in the real world of medicine. So that is the story with the organization. The basic structure has not really changed over the year. There continues to be an office of the commissioner, specific centers that do a lot of the technical work, and a field component. That really has never changed since FDA's inception. But the particulars, especially in the office of the commissioner, have in fact changed. So there are frequent reorganizations. So there's a long history of headquarters in the field going all the way back to the days of it being in USDA. There have been changes, as I mentioned in the previous lecture. There's been an evolution from the chief task of FDA being one of enforcement to its current task being one of policy development, standards development, regulation issuances that allow it to take a more systematic approach to the protection of the public health. The Office of the Commissioner has had a recent expansion. It does get reorganized pretty much every time a new president comes in, and in fact gets reorganized sometimes a few times within the course of a single administration. It did over my term there most recently. Some of the actors remain the same. The Office of the Chief Counsel is still there, but you will note, and I'll mention later, that the Office of the Chief Counsel actually is not part of the FDA, although she serves, the Chief Counsel and their office serves to provide legal advice to the Commissioner. They are actually from the Department of Health and Human Services. The individual centers that are most important to this class are the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, or CDER, the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, CBER, the Center for Devices and Radiologic Health, CDRH, the Center for Veterinary Medicine, CVM, and the Center for Food Safety and Nutrition, or CIFSAN. The newest center is the Center for Tobacco, and I don't know its formal name yet. I should have looked that up. One of you can do that. But these centers are divided into offices, and the offices are divided into divisions. The divisions are divided into branches, and the branches are divided into teams. So that's the taxonomy of the Food and Drug Administration. We start off with the department, HHS, the agency, FDA, the centers within the agency, the within the centers there are offices. Sometimes there are Uber offices. One office may oversee another office. But continuing down to offices, then there are divisions, offices, divisions, and branches and teams. Okay, so the mainstay of product review, that is the subject of this course, are CBER, CDER, and CDRH. And you should know that the Office of the Commissioner rarely acts on substantive matters of specific product-related matters without the input from a center. So it is not a top-down system in many ways. Ideally, it's a bottom-up system where independent review by independent reviewers in particular teams are brought through various disciplines. Information is fed in and fed upward rather than downward. Okay, the field, just to mention the field a little bit, it has 5 regions. There are 20 district offices, and there are additional resident inspection posts. The regional directors in each of these regions report to the Associate Commissioner of Regulatory Affairs. There are district and state offices that do the nuts and bolts work of conducting inspections, evaluating compliance, basically. Compliance is the word that means are they complying with the regulations that have been established, or are products or processes violative? So the district sometimes works with other state health agencies, with local health agencies, and other federal agencies, and I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. The field recommends actions, or can recommend actions, to the Office of the Chief's Counsel, and for criminal actions to the U.S. Attorney, the Department of Justice. So as I mentioned, the Office of the Chief Counsel is oddly not part of the FDA. It's actually part of the DHHS's Office of General Counsel. It advises on law and policies and basically gives the commissioner insight into the question about when there is conflict, would the agency prevail with the courts if we came to that. There is a hierarchy as well with regards to commissioners. There is the commissioner, that's right, right now that's Dr. Margaret Hamburg. There's the immediate deputy commissioner, which will be, I believe it's going to be Dr. Spielberg at this time on, November 3rd, 2011. And then there are deputy commissioners. For example, Dr. Mac Lumpkin was the deputy commissioner for international affairs for the agency. Numerous deputy commissioner for science, other deputy commissioners. There are reporting sometimes to the deputy commissioners and sometimes reporting directly to the commissioner herself, associate commissioners, and there are a handful or half a dozen, perhaps a few more of those. And then there are assistant commissioners who are underneath hierarchically the commissioner herself. So those various stripes of commissioners form the leadership of the Food and Drug Administration. In your book, there is a very nice example, 2-3 page example, on a case history to show how various components within the FDA and various components outside of the FDA can work together on a particular problem. The case history that's related is one of salad greens that were grown contrary to good agricultural practice and good manufacturing practice, resulting in contamination or adulteration would be the legal term, with infectious agents, and how the various agencies would fit into this. There's a description of how CDC might be the ones to discover an outbreak, because CDC is most closely, another HHS agency, most closely connected to state and local health departments. and to the infrastructure of public health and reportable disease, and particularly surveillance, the surveillance of adverse events. Adverse events is what we call them in drugs, but outbreaks or epidemics might be what they would be called in more conventional public health parlance. So there was a description of how FoodNet, I believe it was called FoodNet, I don't know if it still is, a system for the recordation of pulse field gel electrophoresis patterns from cases of people who were in the hospitals and from isolates of from stool or from food sources can all be matched up together, and that when these fingerprints, if you will, of various organisms are put into a computer and all compiled centrally, it allows outbreak detection and investigation that can implicate a particular food source. So pulse field gel electrophoresis is used for this with Escherichia coli, and actually was instrumental in an outbreak that I did with the USDA for Listeria monocytogenes some 10, 12 years ago. So CDC folds in this public health information. There is interagency collaboration between CDC and FDA on it can be multiple things, by the way. It's not necessarily just food, but CDC has other components that detect hospital infections, which can be related to indwelling medical devices, for example, or a whole number of other health events that concern FDA-regulated products. There was another event concerning a cadaveric tissue source that resulted in an outbreak among people who were recipients of that particular cadaver's tissue, of group A streptococcal disease that I was involved in. And that was another instance in which CDC and FDA had to work very, very closely together. So in this particular example in the text, the company's CEO took voluntary action to do a recall. So much of the action which occurs on private parties occurs as a result of strong suggestion by federal agencies rather than formal action, strong suggestion to take a voluntary action, such as a recall. Having said that, even though a recall can certainly result in a lot of bad press for a company and some financial costs in terms of taking product that had been made and destroying it, companies would likely suffer far greater negative effects from not complying with suggestions to do a recall. Even still, in many instances, much of the food which was detected and was subject to the recall has already been purchased and consumed in many cases. That may or may not be true with drugs all the time, but recalls are a blunt force instrument of public health protection, whereas a much better instrument is a proactive system in which regulations define what the appropriate processes are and mandate safeguards along the way, such as HACCP control, and you'll hear about that somewhere else in the text, to assure that things are done right so that problems are prevented rather than, again, finding something and trying to correct it ex post facto. Okay. So, as you know, the agency is engaged in rulemaking. That whole evolution of FDA has been an evolution from an enforcement activity to a rulemaking activity. And the authorities take action against violative products is strong, so the ability to be a cop, the statute that's there enables FDA to do that, and the first part of its history was a lot of that, and it retains that function and still works in that function, but rulemaking is much better because enforcement is resource intensive. If you really want to be the cop, you got to have a lot of cops, and they don't have a lot of cops because there isn't a lot of money for cops. there are two rulemaking processes that we need to review. One is Section 701E, which elaborates a very formalized system, and then Section 701A, which is a brief nominal system that is not process intensive the way that Section 701 is. 701E is, excuse me. So, so instead of seizing a misbranded product, publishing regulations for how to, here's an example for why rulemaking is better than enforcement. Instead of we need to have some rules for how to label a nutritional substance, a food, okay? And one approach would be, oh, we just go out and we'll find everything that's misbranded and we will take action against them. The other is, let's issue regulations to say, this is how you should brand it. And you should do it this way and this way. You know, let's see if I can find one. Yeah, there you go. Okay, Old Bay, great stuff from Maryland. There's your nutritional facts, and almost all these labels are unified. Those are set out by regulations. If you set out what the regulations are and you tell people how to do it and enable them to do it right and instruct them how to do it right, that can be a lot easier and result in a lot more positive public health impact than just finding people who've done it wrong. So the emphasis is on working with the regulated industry to allow them to comply with the public health impetus for it. So, and the most important thing is, the reason this whole system works, the reason this evolution has occurred, is because the courts have been willing to allow it. Courts, as we mentioned earlier, are very poor venues for the analysis of complex scientific information. To the extent that the courts have faith in the executive branch's ability to promulgate regulations which are fair and meaningful and commonsensical and not capricious, but actually advance specific public health ends, they have been willing to just recognize the authority of the FDA. So there are two different kinds of regulations that are described in the text: substantive regulations and interpretive regulations. Now, the substantive regulations derive directly from the statute and just say, okay, here's the statute, says you got to do this, here's the regulations, explains that you got to do this. Interpretive regulations are necessary whenever, especially when lawmakers write vague laws, which they are known to do sometimes. And those interpretive regulations try to implement the sense of the spirit of the statute. So substantive regulations are more difficult for the courts to overrule because you'd have to prove that the original statute was unconstitutional. Whereas interpretive regulations, the courts only need to, in order to overrule it, need to say, no, this is the wrong interpretation of the legislation. So it's much more labile to a court overruling. Cases that I wanted to mention in this regards include Weinberger versus Hunson and Westcott versus Dunning in 1973. The court upheld the regulation issued under Section 701A for, quote, substantial evidence of effectiveness for drugs. The court chose not to take up the broad scientific question about whether or not the products are effective, but instead focused only on the question of whether or not the manufacturers complied with the regulation. So that's a much easier call for a court to make, is what did this or did this not comply with the regulation, rather than is it or is it not effective. So that bolstered the FDA's authority with regards to its ability to issue regulations in the conduct of its mission. Any regulation's validity, however, can be taken up by the court, and when it is, the administrative record, how that regulation came to be, is key. So did the FDA follow the rules with regards to issuing public notice that a regulation is pending? Did it take in all the public comment? Did it answer all those public comments adequately? with evidence of deliberation and have good reasons for rejecting certain oppositions before it went forward with the final rule. So the administrative record is key in the defense of particular regulations. A good example of this, on which there was a considerable fight, was the nutrition labeling regulations from the 1970s that I mentioned earlier. There are internal processes of, however, these internal processes of regulation generation have become increasingly difficult for the agency. So you should know that the more recent history has not been that it's gotten easier to make a reg. In fact, it's been quite more difficult as the politics of the states, of the United States, has had increasing concern about the economic impacts of an increasingly regulatory system. So there are now layers of review in the Office of the Commissioner, in DHHS, in the Office of Management and Budget, about which I'll speak a little bit more later, and in the White House. There are new systems that require that new regulations consider environmental impacts, that they consider economic burdens. So special studies have to be done in addition before these, in addition to the rest of the administrative record. And the Paperwork Reduction Act, which has quite a lot of paperwork associated with it itself, trust me on this. But so there are new systems that have made it more difficult now than, say, 30 years ago for the agency to implement new regulations. And that is part of the reason why regulations are such a cumbersome process right now, and it's one of the challenges that the agency is facing. I also want to mention guidance documents. As you know, part of this class will involve the presentation on various guidance documents, and they do not have the force of law, but their objective is to clarify and explain how to achieve regulatory compliance, perhaps to outline review practices. So sometimes guidances certainly are public statements. They are generally issued for the community at large, but often they have content which can direct individuals within the agency for how to do a review, for example. So individual reviewers and others will look to the guidance as much as people from the outside look to the guidance for what to submit. People on the inside look to the guidances for how to receive what is submitted. So they are often written in a Q&A format. Here's the question, here's the answer, here's the question, here's the answer. That's somewhat useful sometimes. Not all of them are written that way. Officially, there are two levels of guidances. There's a level 1 guidance, which is an initial interpretation of regulation or statute. So the first time a guidance is issued, it says, okay, well, this is what we mean by this, and this is what we're thinking about this. And then there's level 2, which describe existing practices or minor changes in all of this. So public meetings, before guidances, there are often public meetings, and there are regulations that describe how to have a public meeting. Part 15 meetings are one kind of meeting. It's not described in the text, but I'll let you know that this is a meeting that the agency has increasingly issued to seek comment from the community at large. Not a meeting in which the agency speaks to a particular issue or propounds an opinion on a scientific or public health matter, but rather one in which it is in a listening mode and hears from the populace how they feel about a particular area of drug regulation. There are often meetings before guidances, and these too, like the regulations themselves, must be announced in the Federal Register. The Federal Register is the document through which the government communicates to the body politic. So the guidances are, as I mentioned, are not laws, but they do represent, quote, current thinking. And they may suggest a mechanism for moving forward in a submission to achieve compliance, but they often explicitly state that this may not be the only way that you could achieve compliance with laws or regulations. So I do want to mention that there are rules regarding, I guess I mentioned already, there are rules regarding meetings and transparency in meetings. The agency is increasingly attempting to be transparent with people, and so closed-door meetings are becoming less and less and less common, except in the instances in which we're talking about commercially confidential information. But if we're talking about policies, they tend to be very open meetings. There is a rule called the FACA, the Federal Advisory Committee Act, I believe it is, which regulates much of this, and the General Services Administration has regs that specify how advisory committees can be handled. Section 21 of the CFR in Part 14 describes policies and processes for closed and open meetings. But the agency needs often to rely upon outside experts. There are, again, the underlying theme here is that this is an agency which cannot possibly have all of the technical expertise that it needs. So it needs to rely upon the scientific community, the medical community. Sometimes these are brought into the context of advisory committees, and people who serve on advisory committees often are assigned special status as a special government employee. So they are conferred with the title of being a government employee, and for the time that they're actually performing their acts for the government in this advisory capacity. Why that's important is because that makes them subject to rules with regards to confidentiality. So if the best person to know about a particular product we want to make sure that if they receive commercially confidential information, they can't use that for their own gain later on or against in a competitive sense. These advisory committees are listed in your text, a lot of them, the standing ones anyways. There are other ad hoc advisory committees that are set up from time to time. They generally consist of 9 to 15 members who serve for a period of years, sometimes up to about 4 years, and meeting once or twice a year. The advisory committee presentation is a big deal for a company that is looking to get a product on market, because even though that advisory committee has very little formal power with regards to the ability to approve or not approve a drug, it is asked specific questions that are directly relevant to that approval or non-approval process. And the history has shown that the agency considers great weight the input of its advisory committees. In fact, most product approvals require an advisory committee consent in order to move forward. So these tend to be meetings of considerable gravity and coverage by the business media, and patients come, and lots of lawyers come, and it's a big deal. The advisory committee members are subject to special rules with regards to being non-conflicted. They need to disclose their financial information of themselves and others. Conflict of interest is the general rule is if greater than $50,000 is on the line, if they have greater than $50,000 interest in a particular product, then they cannot serve on that committee. However, even lesser degrees are important, because it is not just the real conflict of interest that doesn't matter. It is the perception of the conflict of interest which poses a threat to the integrity of the process. This is a big issue with orphan drugs, by the way, because often the numbers of specialists or experts in an orphan drug area are very, very few. And the ability to find a person who is completely non-conflicted in the outcome of the deliberations of an advisory committee can be very difficult if there aren't too many experts. You should know that the FDA relies not only upon its own advisory committees, but upon outside groups from time to time. It'll bring in the Institute of Medicine, was recently brought in to review the 510K process of device approvals. The National Academy of Sciences and other groups are often brought into the table to assist the FDA in its scientific deliberations. FDA works with other agencies. Most of the time, there is some overlap in the enabling legislation which has been granted to FDA and the enabling legislation which has been granted to other agencies such as USDA, EPA, FTC, and so on. So the way that the agencies work this out is usually through a memorandum of understanding, or an MOU, which says, okay, well, you'll do this and we'll do that, and you'll do this and we'll do that, and they put that in place, and it creates a lot less confusion, a lot more predictability about how their various legislative mandates will be implemented. So as we mentioned earlier, USDA regulates meat and poultry. It inspects and grades, though, fresh fruits and vegetables and grains. So if your maple syrup is grade A or grade B, that's a USDA marking. There are literally scores of memorandum of understanding between FDA and USDA. For example, the Agricultural Marketing Service develops commercial grade standards. There's an MOU that specifies that the AMS will advise FDA on any violative packers or processors that it finds in the conduct of its investigations through processing plants. The FSIS, the Food Safety Inspection Service, is a part of the FDA that I worked for previously. There is a story which I will try to tell you in class, since I'm running out of time right now, on lead in baby food. Please ask me that story, and I will relate it at that time. EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, administers the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act. The FIFRA, the FIFRA, sets tolerances, and that's part of Section 408 of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And the EPA also determines safe residues in food under a 1970 reorganization. So there's overlap, and they sorted this all out as to who will administer which part. The chemical additives has some shared authority with EPA. The implementation of the Toxic Substances Control Act is done under agreements between EPA and FDA. So the Federal Trade Commission, we say that FDA regulates about a quarter of the U.S. economy. It has some help in this. The Federal Trade Commission is part of that help. There's concurrent jurisdiction over labeling and advertising of over-the-counter drugs, foods, and so on. The Federal Trade Commission exercises responsibility for advertising, and FDA generally exercises authority on labeling. Under the Federal Trade Commissions Act, or the FTC Act, FTC investigates and prosecutes unfair methods of competition. So, for example, price fixing. What would happen if there were only 2 or 3 manufacturers of a particular drug? They all get together and they all say, hey, we're just going to jack our price up 1,000%, and everybody here in this room is going to keep the price at this level. Well, that would be contrary to the Federal Trade Commission's rules. And even though it relates to a particular drug, that's not regulated strictly by the FDA because of these agreements between the agencies. So FTC, you should note, has special powers with regards to its regulatory action. It's got 5 commissioners, and they can issue cease and desist orders that are a novel mechanism separate from FDA's authorities. The Consumer Product Safety Commission was established in 1973. It implements the Federal Hazardous Substances Act, and there have been a number of questions over where overlapping authority between the Consumer Product Safety Commissioner and FDA exist, particularly over containers. They now do, as I mentioned earlier, implement the statutes which require child-proof containers for medicines. But there were questions over when a container leaches into the medicine, whose jurisdiction is it then? I think many of those things have been sorted out now. The BPA, or bisphenol A, problem that we had a few years back, and that went on and still continues with another agency, CDC, being in the mix and having different opinions as to what the public health impact of that possible adulterant was. So you can see that differing agencies can come at this with their varying authorities, and sometimes takes a little while to sort out who's in charge here. Okay? So the DEA, and that's the Drug Enforcement Agency, and NIDA, the National Institutes of Drug Abuse. NIDA is actually over part of NIH, part of the National Institutes of Health. are also engaged, like FDA, in the regulations of drugs of abuse. Um, DEA has been was recently brought in and accorded authorities to act in interdiction and as the police officers. It is the one that establishes schedules. Schedules are levels of control for products, how they have to be handled, what kinds of permissions are needed to receive access to them, um, and all of that. So FDA makes scheduling recommendations, but it's actually DEA that defines the schedule. Uh, the National Institute of Drug Abuse actually provides advice on the addictive potential of various components. So all of these work together on treatment programs as well. Drugs of abuse are an incredible problem in the United States, have been for a long time. Probably really burst on the scene in the 60s. Continues to change in its nature over time. And there was a while back when crack cocaine was the biggest issue in town. Those are changing into other new questions. And it's a rapidly evolving field, but FDA has to work with its other counterpart agencies in order to have an impact there. The Department of Justice and FDA work together frequently, as was mentioned earlier. The Department of Justice is the U.S. Attorney, is the component that brings criminal charges on behalf of the FDA. I mentioned the Centers for Disease Control, who I've also worked for about a third of my time in federal service. And they have an interesting group that you should know about called the Epidemic Intelligence Service. Small group of a young cadre of young physicians, pharmacists, well, not pharmacists, physicians, PhDs for the most part, sometimes a nurse or a lawyer thrown in, who do shoe leather epidemiology, investigating outbreaks wherever they occur, and they do occur all the time, and learning what the etiology is and implementing control measures. This naturally has important implications for the products which FDA regulates. But CDC is not a regulatory agency. It can't take actions against people who own products or manufacture them or anything like that. That all exists strictly with FDA. And sometimes the two agencies will come to different conclusions about particular products because where there may be scientific evidence which is accumulated suggesting a particular course of public health intervention, there may not be substantive legal evidence that would allow the agency to prevail in its actions. And so sometimes these operations, I don't know if disharmonious is too strong a word to use, but are not completely congruent, let's put it that way. So fortunately, as we mentioned, both of them are agencies within Health and Human Services, and the integration of their two efforts is vested in the person of the Secretary of DHHS. Congress, of course, is another body that the agency has to report to. For any agency in the federal government, Congress has three functions: legislative, enabling it, saying what it's got to do, deciding what the laws of the lands are, is a legislative act. Oversight, checking up on them, making sure that they're doing what we said we have to do. And finally, paying for it, getting the money to them. FDA has an Office of Legislative Affairs. It's in the Office of the Commissioner, and it tightly controls FDA's activities with regards to interactions with Congress. As you can imagine, congressmen are made of people who are elected from their various regions, and they answer to their constituents. So oftentimes, their constituents will have an issue with FDA. My device hasn't been approved, says the manufacturer that is in Kansas or in Peoria or somewhere in the heartland, speaks to their congressional representative. Their congressional representative shoots over a letter. Where's that going to land? In the Office of Legislative Affairs and then make its way down. That is not a way to get things done, I will add, because the agency, generally speaking, will defer to the scientific expertise of the reviewers. So it is not subject to that kind of political pressure. What it is subject to is that the commissioner sets a tone, she or he is appointed by the president, and policies and practices are prescribed by the elected officials who are appointed throughout it. But generally speaking, individual decisions are not supposed to be subject to political will. And I think that there is a respect for that throughout the agency, and it is extremely rare that it happens otherwise. So, um, the appropriations committees are oddly enough, this is one of the strange things about the way that the FDA works, is that the people who give it money are still coming from the agricultural subcommittees. Because FDA was originally part of USDA, its money still comes from those agricultural House and Senate subcommittees. Yet its authorizing committees are the House Committee on Energy and Commerce and the Senate Committee on Labor and Human Relations. So the people who are saying, this is what you got to do, are somewhat disconnected from the people who are paying the money for doing what you got to do. So that leads to the issue of the potential for unfunded mandates. We're going to tell you you have to do this, but we're not going to give you money to do it. We're not going to allow you the people to do it. And so you can imagine that's not necessarily the most efficient system. Another agency I want to mention is the Government Accountability Office, or the GAO. This is a supposedly nonpartisan, not Democrat or Republican, office, which is an accountancy, and they will go in on specific questions. There have been numerous GAO study reports that have come out on things such as post-marketing commitments. That was a recent one that came out that showed that the agency had approved a number of products on the condition that after marketing, certain studies would be done to make sure that they were safe and effective. And the GAO came in and reviewed what had actually happened was, yeah, this thing got on the market, but those studies that were supposed to occur afterwards didn't all happen. So that's an example of the way that the GAO can be put into this process and can allow for Congress's oversight activities to occur. There's more in your text about the ways that FDA works with states and international agencies. It is, however, in the executive branch of government, as we've already mentioned, the Office of Management and Budget has had an increasing role in regulating FDA internally within the executive branch because it reviews the rulemaking processes, many of which have become more increasingly cumbersome as a result of processes that are held within OMB. For example, anytime you want to make a new form, there is a lot of OMB review that you need to go through. And speaking as a scientist, scientists like to collect new data, and data has to be done in the context of surveys often. If you want to do that, you may be looking at, if you're a worker bee level federal employee, you may be looking at 2, 3, 4 years to get your form through the OMB process. It can take that long. But the OMB is an important component of regulating rulemaking, budgetary requests. It has a very important role, and making any new forms. The Inspector General is an important component that looks internally at FDA in the event of any law breaking by federal employees. So Inspector General and that apparatus is deployed anytime that there's a question that perhaps somebody within the government is doing anything untoward and illegal. So with that, we have gone over the Food and Drug Administration, how it works, its various components, some of the people that it works with, and it should end up being a lively discussion. Look forward to talking to you all in the class discussion, and we will see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.